Yeah, great. Okay, so hopefully, apologies, the camera looks a bit weird. So the way we're going to do this is I'll talk a little bit at the start, and then Mahima's going to take over, partly because he knows a great deal more about it than I do. In fact, mostly because of that, and also he's a good presenter. I'll just sort of do some sort of very, very arm wavy sort of ideas. And one of the things that we came from for being, and we're very glad to be invited for this, is to sort of get some feedback from people who are working in different areas of the fields of psychology and neuroscience and AI as well, just to get to us whether these questions that we're thinking about are relevant to them, and whether that any of these ideas make sense, and particularly if they don't make sense. I mean, it's the quickest and easiest way to find out if something is a terrible idea is an expert looks at it and goes, no, you can't do that. So I think the plan would probably be, given the way we're doing it, to have questions at the end rather than in between. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
That would be good.
Okay, fantastic. Great. Okay, so I might share the screen, and okay, let's do that. And that's the one. Is that it? Sure, there we are. And of course, I've gone a bit mad because we have Teams, we have Blackboard, all sorts of things. Anyway, have we go. So again, Mahima's work. This is Mahima's sort of PhD work mostly, and I think it's really interesting, and hopefully you do too. Okay, right. And now I work out how to do the next thing, which is actually find the screen that will actually take it on to the next one. Okay, slash.
So yeah.
There we go. Right. Yeah. Takes a little while. So going to talk a little bit about artificial neural networks. And one thing, I know computer scientists have got a lot of form for this, which is we take words that other people use in other areas, and then we start making it into our word. And then we sometimes come back and accuse the people who originally had it of being wrong about it. So apologies if you see this happening. We'll try not to do that too much, but it tends to be a bit of a sort of occupational hazard. And move that across so I can see it. Oh, maybe I can't. So looking at artificial neural networks and the brain, and then spiking neural networks, and that's where Mahima will start actually talking about some of the sort of good stuff that he's been doing, and the research, of course, that he's leading, and plasticity, and conclusions and future work. And one of the things before at the start, I think I'd be really happy if people get some ideas around whether artificial neural networks can say something sensible about how plasticity works in the brain. And similarly, are there ways, looking at neuroscience, where we can look at optimization of artificial neural networks in terms of really making them optimize in a way that is controllable and can be described to people. One of the sort of, I suppose, central issues with a lot of the publications in this area is that we do, it's often really good prediction or classification, but how exactly it's been done is a little bit unsure, because there's a line in the paper that says the network was tuned, or we chose these parameters, which is not necessarily obvious why that's happened, or what exactly they've done, and whether it then works with other application areas, with other data sets, etc. So this has come back. I mean, as we introduced, Leonora introduced us. I'm interested in health IT mostly, and this is one of the big objections to using some of these techniques in health IT, is that it's sort of coming out from nowhere. It's sort of about explanatory capacity about the network, but it's also about the method that's being used. Okay, and I've got a bit of hay fever, and apologies, it's not COVID, it's hay fever. I'll get a tissue. There we go. Right, so I'm not. Okay, so hopefully it's not a completely new idea, this idea of artificial neural networks. And they've been around for a long time and had various waves of being popular and non-popular, so going back to the 70s, really. And one of the big advantages that they have for practical use in computer science is that they can model relationships between inputs and classifications, for example, in a way that is non-linear and uses potentially all the relevant data in a way that you cannot do necessarily by pure statistical means. Now, you can argue about whether that's a good thing or not. They're not deterministic, so it does, their structure and their outputs do depend on the order in which you present examples to them. So that's obviously a big issue. But they also seem to be able to solve problems which are often quite difficult for other methods. But the other things is that for a long time also people have said, well, actually, it's an artificial neural network, i.e. it's an artificial model of the neuronal processing in brains. And there's this idea of plausibility, which I think is a good word. Plausible, does it mean it's true? No, but it's plausible. And so maybe we can have some crossover, maybe we can have some benefit from looking at how these networks behave and how we can engineer them that might be able to inform our colleagues in neuroscience. And of course, there are problems, and I'll talk about that in a bit. And really then, we're looking at, to say, these artificial neural networks effectively take data, make predictions, usually have some sort of feedback mechanism going on within them so that the prediction gets better as you produce more cases, and in some ways behave a bit like real networks. But of course, that some ways thing is always the tricky bit. So what can they do? And I do like the graph here. Effectively, that's what a neural network does. It's a wiggly line. So it doesn't matter how complex the relationship is, within reason, we can draw lines which associate, we can get relationships between data sets and their classifications. So is it going to be sunny tomorrow based on the weather today, the wind, sea temperatures, all these various huge number of variables which we don't necessarily have a physical relationship that we know between them, and we can't necessarily write a good equation for that relationship. But the neural network, in some ways, discovers what those internal relationships are and then gives us that function. All sorts of issues with whether that's reproducible, whether that applies to different sort of areas, and how much you can actually learn from those models. But it's actually, there've been a lot of successes in terms of particularly image processing, recognizing features and things like that. So it does, it may not work in theory, but it does in practice. I'd also like to say that I sort of see neural networks and often a lot of machine learning tools as a hypothesis generator. So what we're saying is, yeah, we can classify things, but also we can say, well, these things seem to be important. And once we've done that, then we can go back to that data set and say, why is this important? What's the real relationship between these things? Because these things are not. So if we go back to weather, for example, that there is a physical relationship between the different components affecting weather. There, something's happening. The molecules are moving. There's temperature flow. There's heat flow. There's all sorts of things going on. So sometimes what we can classify and what we need to use to do the classification and how complex that classification is and all that sort of thing can give us a guide to some of the potential hypotheses that might be then worth investigating for something else. And so it's an awful lot of, comes back to this whole idea almost of do we want to know the answer, and do we want to know why the answer? And sometimes we just want to know the answer, and sometimes we want to know why the answer, and sometimes we want both. And they've done very well. So of course, so just at the end of the last year, DeepMind published papers in Nature, etc., about being able to predict protein folding, which is, of course, an incredibly important area of research, and also one of these things that people felt very much so that this was a very, very difficult problem. And of course, it's not an easy solution, but this certainly, there's a lot of talk about how, in fact, this is actually may potentially revolutionize biochemistry, etc. But more to the point, it's saying that for my purposes in this talk, that it's saying actually these are doing something useful, and they're doing something useful that people haven't been able to do easily. So, right, hopefully at this point you're saying, okay, well, even if I don't like them, and somebody described to me machine learning techniques as basically magical thinking once, which I thought was a bit harsh, but anyway, then they do seem to actually produce results. But I do like this thing about the map's not the territory and the word is not the thing. So being a computer scientist, possibly it's an occupational hazard. We're sort of saying, okay, right, so now we talk a lot about biological plausibility in artificial neural networks. And there's a lot of issues around that. So I won't talk too much about spiking neural networks because Mahima is going to talk about that, but that's a way of modeling neural networks. And of course, the things to worry about if we're saying that this is modeling, that our artificial network is somehow similar to a real network or a biological network, then how come they're so small? You know, why do you, if we can do this prediction with even the deep mind things have got relatively small numbers, it's only thousands of connections, of nodes, of neurons rather. So humans have got 100 billion, or 90 billion, or whatever number you want. So there's clearly a massive scale difference there. And at those sort of differences, it's probably something there's the whole interesting thing about why those scale differences happen. If humans could do processing with the size of networks that artificial neural networks have got, why do we need a brain? I mean, obviously that's a bit of a silly question, but human brains have got lots of different structures, of course, and artificial neural networks tend to be pretty homogeneous. And then possibly one of the reasons why there is a difference between the size is because our artificial neural networks don't store the data themselves. They build a model of the data. So it's not the territory, but they build a model of it, and then that makes the classification. So we have got some issues there. But clearly, if we're going to say that our neural networks can somehow model or explain some of the properties of biological networks, or similarly, properties of biological networks can help us build neural networks, we've got to be a bit aware of these issues. I like this idea of a plausibility probe. So the idea behind this really is to say, if you can find a way to mimic behavior in a simple way, then at least there's some possibility that that's related to how it happens in real life. Okay, so there's lots of qualifiers there. There are tons and tons of qualifiers. Okay, so I'm not saying that if a artificial neural network can do it, then that's how the brain does it. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying it is possible that it can help us understand that. And coming from the outside, it's worth looking at the open worm thing. I won't look at it now, but basically it's a flat worm model, and it's got about 1,000 neurons in the biological worm, and they're quite good models being built that seem to actually duplicate that worm's behavior in real life, and you get robots and things like that. So I think we can distribute the slides, and watch YouTube. You can see somebody with this robot based around the 1,000 network model, 1,000 neuron model, actually behaving like the worm does. And I'd argue that we've got a bit of space here. So that psychologists and even sociologists as well, you're looking at, okay, how do people behave in the real world? We've got stimulus, and then we have activity and behavior. And that can be around, we recognize things of food, or we react to people's emotions, all sorts of things happen. And that they're really good. You know, we've got lots of really good evidence around that and where that might have come from in evolutionary terms, and also some, you know, really sort of deep understanding and, well, certainly deep theories about how this might be happening. And Anna, who's on the call, she's looking at some of the stuff to do with pigeon behavior and things like that. So it's not just humans. And of course, the neuroscientists and people who are working in petri dishes with individual neurons or with very, very simple organisms can also show you how the actual neurons behave. They can show changes in electrical potentials. They can show you the neurotransmitters being generated. They can show changes in response to environmental stimuli, both in terms of stimulating the neuron, but also in terms of general things like, you know, effective medications and stuff like that. And what I'd like to suggest as my probably final arm waving thing to say is maybe using artificial networks is a tool that can be used to link these two areas. So I'm making the assumption that we can't easily take psychological effects and demonstrate those at the neuronal level. And similarly, neuronal level effects, although we can obviously with some medications, are hard to show to behavioral effects on complete organisms, particularly people. However, what the artificial network is doing something that's a bit like behavior, i.e. it's doing classification and things like that. It's doing human type tasks. But at the same time, we can see what it's doing. And Mahima is going to show some great sort of slides about how we can actually see what's going on within that network, which may be something that a neuroscientist or a neurophysiologist can actually measure within a petri dish, within individual neurons or small numbers, maybe. Okay, and that might then lead to information about sizes of networks, about plasticity of networks, and how they change over time. Okay, and I will take it over to you. So I'll stop sharing my slide, and now it's up to you, Mahima.
Okay, Dave, thank you very much. Let me get my presentation going. Am I audible to everyone, Leno?
Yeah, we can hear
cool.
you.
Okay, right, so. Okay, so now that we have a little bit of a background on brain and artificial neural networks, what they can do, let's quickly look at spiking neuron and what we mean by a spiking neuron. I'm sure most of the neuroscience and even psychology related researchers are aware of the spiking neuron and the biological behavior of that. So this picture over here depicts how a biological neuron would function roughly. And on the right-hand side, we want to compare these two, right? So what happens in a computational neuron or a computational spiking neuron, there are spikes or signals coming from other neurons to this particular neuron. And they are connected via weights. So these weights represent the synaptic connection. Based on the weights, the input signals might be amplified or they might be inhibited. And those signals move into the neuron. And if it's a neuron like integrate type neuron, it will integrate the signals. And if the voltage threshold goes beyond a certain point, it'll emit a spike. Thus, we call it a spiking neuron. Now, that being said, it's ideal that we look at how the progression had taken place to this neuron when it comes to computer science. So this neuron is basically understood as the third generation of neurons. Before that, there were networks, artificial neural networks built on two other generations, like a Boolean function, 1 or 0 function, or a would have heard about ReLU or sigmoid functions. Now, this spike in mathematically, we call it a Dirac delta function, which represents the spike. So artificial spiking neural networks, there are many mathematical models to it, like Hodgkin-Huxley, leaky integrated fire, or Izikevich model. So if I take you to an Izikevich model, which has two equations that can represent all these behaviors, from tonic spiking to phasic spiking and many other spiking behavior can be mimicked using those two equations in Izikevich model. So those are the spiking neurons, neuron types, and how the progression had taken place. Now, what is a neural network? If you are familiar with the second generation neural network, which has shown so much of success in terms of classification problems like image classification, most of the algorithms that are run by Google, the deep learning stuff. So all of that depends on these neural architectures. So what we can do is actually, we can use these architectures and embed our neuron or the spiking neuron and make use out of it. For our purpose, because we are basically looking at fundamentals of spiking neural networks, how they work, why do they give good accuracies, why do they give bad accuracies, how can we improve them? So for that, we need to basically understand the fundamentals of it. So without going for a very complicated model, we are looking at a simple feed-forward mechanism. So our data is propagated on a feed-forward mechanism. In our network, there are no recurrent connections, which I will show you later on. So these are various types of neural networks that we can use, which we can embed our spiking neuron to. And our method is using a simple feed-forward mechanism. Now, you might wonder how spiking neural networks would learn. In, I would refer to as SNN. In the SNN domain, or spiking neural networks domain, the most commonly used biological plausible algorithm is spike time dependent plasticity. There's a mathematical representation to this plasticity mechanism. So based on that mechanism, what happens is if the presynaptic neuron, that's A over here, spikes, and then the B neuron spikes. So that means there is a long-term potentiation, or the weight between these two will increase. If that happens vice versa, it will decrease. So this stems from the Hebb's postulate that mentions neurons that fire together, wire together. So that's how, when we propagate data, that's how the network learns the valuable information in the incoming data based on spiking activity. So spike time dependent plasticity is a key mechanism that we use in our network. Having said that, let's look at, in an overall perspective, what are the advantages of using a spiking neural network instead of first generation or second generation neural networks. So as you can see, these are some of the advantages that we have. But what we need to realize is, if we need to fully enhance or fully get the benefit of the SNN, we need to run them on neuromorphic platforms. So neuromorphic is a different type of a hardware platform to general von Neumann architecture that these computers are running on. So ideally, SNN should be on neuromorphic platforms, which will produce low power consumption and fast inference and event-driven information processing. So it's very promising future for SNNs because there's a lot of neuromorphic hardware now being built by big companies as well. In terms of research, when we think of what type of data that is more suited to be explored using spiking neural networks, it's basically spatiotemporal data. Data that has both spatial and temporal correlations built into the signal. Those type of signals we can explore more using spiking neural networks. So spatiotemporal data such as EEG. EEG comes from a spatial location of the scalp, let it be your prefrontal cortex or occipital lobes. So generating from those spatial areas, and it has temporally varying voltages. So all that information is built into this signal. So spiking neural networks are ideal because of its capability of handling big capacity data to process spatiotemporal data. So having the background of artificial neural networks, spiking neural networks, and spatiotemporal data, EEG, that is what we use. Let me bring you all to the same platform of to what we do actually, our research focus. So what we are trying to do is we are trying to use spiking neural networks, spatiotemporal data, and machine learning techniques to preferably explore human mental stress. So we use EEG data that is related to stress, and we try to classify and explore through these networks, their behavior and the ability to classify data. One of the issues that we have with spiking neural networks is that it's relatively new to artificial intelligence, and there is, in terms of learning, there needs to be a lot of development that needs to be done. So spiking neural networks being coming from sort of biologically inspired nature, we were really interested in pushing forward with spike term dependent plasticity, STDP, and other plasticity mechanisms that are there in the brain. So to put everything in a nutshell, what we are trying to do is use other plasticity techniques in brain, like structural plasticity with spiking neural networks, and explore EEG data on human mental stress. So this is a slide of just give you an overview of what's happening in the brain. I'm sure most of you people knows these things better than me. So as I told you earlier, STDP is something that have been used in spiking neural networks already. So we wanted to push it a little further and see what happens when you introduce neurons, introduce synapses, what happens to the neural network, what happens to the performance of the neural network. So these are the questions that we had. And then that led us to explore intrinsic properties as well. That is, inside a neuron, there are a lot of behavior that can be changed using certain parameters. And we wanted to explore that as well, and to come up with a holistic, more profound learning approach for EEG data exploring using spiking neural networks. Just give me a minute. Okay, so for these experiments that I'm going to show you or share details with you, we have used two data sets. One is a brain-computer interface data set that it's a three-class classification problem based on the risk position, 3 risk positions, and EEG is taken out from participants. And the objective of the network is to correctly identify or classify EEG data based on the hand position. So there are 3 classes there. And the other data set that we are talking about is the depth data set. From the depth data set, which is commonly used data set for affect computing, we use that to distinguish stress and relaxed states of the brain. So these are coming from multiple participants. They were shown music videos, and the valence and arousal scores are being taken, and those are matched with the EEG that let us sort of label them and get the model to learn the differences and predict whether the given sample is stressed or a relaxed sample. or relaxed brain state sample. So those are the two data sets. Just let me show you how basically the network works. I hope this comes up. Okay. So nevertheless, I think, okay, this is supposed to be a video where spikes are traveling, so it doesn't seem to work. Anyway, now this layer over here is our input layer. So channels, these are the EEG channels. Depending on the data set, for this data set, there are 32 channels for this data set. And for this data set, there's 14 channels, if I can remember. Yes, 14 channels. So we have a hidden layer and an output layer. We are looking at two things when it comes to this network. One is its learning capability. How best can it classify samples? The other thing is we are interested about is how the network actually behaves inside to generate these performances. So those are the things that we try to investigate and analyze and make sure that we come up with learning algorithms that we can back up, so that we can say, because of these things, this is happening. Thus, this learning algorithm seems to be better. So that being said, oh, started playing all of a sudden. Okay. Right. Okay. So the first thing that we wanted to investigate was structural plasticity, right? We have a hidden layer over here, and we want to see the contribution of that hidden layer in terms of adding and deleting neurons with synapses. What does that do to the network performance? So we set up the network such a way that we push in the input data, we have the network over here, and we receive the accuracy. And we tell the computer to change the middle layer number of neurons until either you achieve the highest accuracy or we complete 5,000 steps, 5,000 combinations of parameters. So this is the way we sort of tested or ran this experiment. We put input data, get the accuracy, and if it's not the highest accuracy, then we send a feedback, change the neural network, or add or delete neurons, and then rerun. So we did this experiment to two data sets. One thing that we were able to achieve was a good classification accuracy, which shows the ability of the network to learn, its learning capability, right? And there's something that is more interesting. So according to our algorithm, it produced 111 hidden layer neurons, saying that, okay, this network performs the best. So this is the one that gives the best accuracy. So we selected that model, which is given here, and we iteratively tested that model with unseen data. So this network is structurally optimized to have 111 neurons, and we tested it with 30 times iteratively with unseen data, how it performs, how it classifies unseen data, right? And to compare its performance with the others, we developed an overgrown model, which is there are more neurons, 50% more neurons in this. So it has 167. Now this is fixed. This 167 is fixed. And 50% less neurons, this over here. So 56 neurons network, 111 neurons, and 167 neurons. So structurally optimized model with overgrown and undergrown models. And then we compared their performance. As you can see, there are two things that we need to understand. One is that this structurally optimized model in terms of robustness, that is resilience to input changes, it's high. Its accuracy is high, its average accuracy is high, and its robustness is good. So a structurally optimized network gives you good robustness, resilience to change has been shown there. And it has better adaptation capability. What is adaptation? So each time we initialize a network, we randomly initialize the weights in the network. So each time we initialize it, when it comes to 30 iterations, each time we've used different data weight sets randomly chosen, right? So wherever the neural network starts, you should learn and you should perform. So irrespective of where the neural network initially starts, it has shown to perform well when it is structurally optimized. Now, we thought this can be something related to the data set, some sort of a behavior that is being caused by the data set. So we wanted to test it with our stress data set. So we have in the stress data set 104 samples labeled as stressed and 104 labeled as relaxed states. In that also we were able to get 91% classification accuracy. Now, when we compare the structurally optimized network, in this case, the preferred structural optimization was 130 neurons in the middle layer. And when we compare it with the undergrown and overgrown models over here, you can again see the similar pattern in this data set as well. So that means structurally optimized networks compared to overgrown and undergrown networks seems to be precise, even though there are changes. It seems to be precise when it comes to producing class. We wanted to investigate what's going on inside the network. So we looked at the neurons and their activity. And we found something interesting, which is in the structurally optimized network, the redundant neurons, the neurons that do not fire during training, are higher when it's taken as a when it's considered as a ratio to the total number of neurons. So here we can see there is a dip. This dip is compared to the neurons that we've used, 111, there's lower amount of redundant neurons, lesser redundancy. That is seen in the second data set as well for both the structurally optimized networks. So this was a really interesting find because this sort of gave us a hint on what could be going on within the network. And we again probed into what's happening into the neuron itself. So in a structurally optimized network, the neuron seems to be preferring a lower threshold. A lower threshold means the network prefers high amount of spiking activity. Lower threshold, high spiking activity. This was seen in both the data sets. Now, after seeing these behaviors, the question is, why did optimized structure perform better in terms of accuracy and or robustness? So as you can see, I've given a raster plot. So this gives the spiking map or spiking that is taking place during training. We can see repeatedly firing neuron here over here. Let me call it a hub neuron. And we see lesser, and the overgrown network, we see more hub neurons. So there is a connected process that is happening. That is, when there are hyperactive neurons, there are more redundant neurons. And when there are redundant neurons, that might lead to hyperactive neurons as well. Anyway, what happens is when you have redundant neurons, although they are not active during training, during testing, they become active, and that actually causes misclassifications. So this is a finding that was really interesting for us, and we wanted to then investigate the threshold dropping. So what we thought of, okay, structural plasticity is giving us these observations. Let's try out intrinsic plasticity as well. So that drives us to the second experiment. In the second experiment, instead of having a fixed threshold, what we did was the threshold of the network or the neuron, we made it flexible so that if the neuron fired earlier, the neuron by itself will increase its threshold by a little bit, right, called theta positive. So these are two parameters. And if it did not fire, it will reduce its threshold. So it will increase its sensitivity. Again, we fixed the network this time. Actually, we did not change the number of neurons. We set it to 150 neurons, and we wanted to test this approach. So for the BCI data set, let me take your attention to this performance over here. When it comes to testing, again, we see a similar behavior where there is higher accuracy, and we were able to, with the two parameters that we chose, we were able to reduce or completely get rid of inactive neurons. So we chose two parameters to completely get rid of inactive neurons, and the accuracies were higher when that happened. So that was one of the observations of the BCI data set. When it comes to emotional stress data set, again, we set parameters so that redundant neurons reduced to 0. And the sort of spread of accuracy is not as good as the fixed one. Although the accuracy was a little less than a fixed threshold. So there was a little bit of contradictory there. But what we saw was that using those two parameters, we can reduce the spiking activity. And with reduced spiking activity, we can still for all have decent amount of accuracy for this data set. So here we are again, the raster plots with intrinsic plasticity, with adaptive threshold. That's given over here, and this is without. So you can see that we can get good performance out of a network with lesser amount of spikes. Even though we have lesser amount of spikes, we can get good activity, good performance. But the spiking activity is also distributed, because almost all the neurons, not almost, but all the neurons in this network is firing, whereas this network, it is not the case. When it comes to emotional stress data set, we saw the same thing happening there as well. So the total number of spikes dropped. This is without IP, and this is with IP. And there was another interesting thing that we saw. If we don't have intrinsic plasticity, there are weights that goes to the upper end. There are huge amount of synapses that touches the upper end of the weight limitation. As you can see, there's about 2000 over here. But when you apply intrinsic plasticity, that reduces drastically. So this actually causes problems for network classification, whereas this is a good indication of robust performance. This is introduced as synaptic potentiation runway synaptic potentiation, where the spike time dependent plasticity weight increase gets caught up in a loop and it keeps on increasing. So let me recap the observations that we saw in structural plasticity. So structural plasticity is good in terms of robustness, inference efficiency, because rather than having too much of neurons, to have the right amount of neurons, it will give you inference with less amount of computation earlier. And in intrinsic plasticity, we definitely see higher efficiency in terms of amount of spikes required for a prediction. The amount of spikes required for a prediction is lessened. And it's a good remedy for runaway synaptic potentiation, which is bound to happen depending on the data set when we are using STDP. Robustness and adaptation capability, it's questionable because the second data set did not give really convincing results. But definitely a connection of these two plasticity mechanisms will be really ideal. Structural plasticity actually makes me think like I like to play a lot of cricket. So if you play the ball often and if you practice a lot, whether your brain circuits get so optimized so that each time you hit the ball, you middle it to the perfection. So these are sort of analogies that comes to my mind. And that probably, that question, maybe the audience can answer it for us. So those are the two main experiments that we wanted to talk to you about and what's going on with them. Definitely when we started, the big question was, just like the second generation neural networks, is it best that we use a big network, use as much as we can? Well, our results say not exactly. There is no such thing as a sweet spot, but definitely there is a range of number of neurons for a given data set that will produce good results. And going beyond STDP is likely to give us better learning capability. And when it comes to machine learning, we believe that it's not only the accuracy that we need to look into. We need to look into robustness, efficiency, adaptation, online learning capability, and scalability of the network, which will enable us to increase the intelligence of artificial intelligence. And that's the right way of, the correct way of actually looking at models. Then another question that came to my mind was, does the neuron itself have a memory so that it keeps track of its firing activities? There's something like that. Some questions that we need to find answers for. And we go back to the introduction where we spoke about, can actually spiking neural networks give, because it has so many parameters that you can play around with, can it give good hypothesis that we can test about the human brain? And the good thing is that you can run iteratively these models and check the behavior and what's going on. So in our future work, our aim is to combine these two algorithms. So we have spike time dependent plasticity, we have a structural plasticity, and we have intrinsic plasticity. How do we combine all of these things together and build a spiking neural network algorithm that can classify and model human mental stress? That's what we are using. That's the data type that we are using. So that's our real goal, and to see how robust and how efficient and how adaptable our SNN is actually with the inclusion of this package of plasticity techniques. So with that, that concludes my presentation. I just want to thank you, everybody who's here, and to my supervisory team Professor Dale Parry is already here, Dr. Wong, and Professor Kasabov. Actually, Dr. Grace Wong have introduced me to Eleanor and to present to you. So thanks for that. And yeah, that concludes the presentation, and we are open for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mahima, for the presentation. Yeah, so we have some time for questions. If anyone wants to ask that, you can either say it, unmute yourself, or you can write it in the chat if you don't have like a microphone capability.
So I have a question. This is
Hi, Paul.
Paul. Yeah, hello. Thanks both for
Yes.
a really interesting talk. Thanks. I'm sort of curious about the choice of the human mental stress data set as a kind of test bed for your models. Not so much that it's not an interesting question to ask, or even I guess you can try and classify anything. But why choose something so complicated? In that, and the reason I think it might be complicated is because the mapping between the sort of brain activity and people's self-report is likely to be pretty noisy.
Yes.
So if I were doing it, I would have chosen something where the mapping was objectively easier to begin with, so that you could see how well your model was performing in a way that was, not embedded in a whole lot of psychological noise as much as model noise.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, even when we take the BCI dataset, when it comes to the wrist movement, getting that network to perform well wasn't that hard. I mean, when it comes to compared to stress. And your question is, why did you use something like stress to begin with? It's sort of a personal preference, actually. And my supervisor, the second supervisor, has a data set that is already there, and we want to explore not only the learning capability, actually the behavior, what's going on in the spiking neural network, whether we can inference something out of it. So as you said, yes, it is challenging, and getting good results is not easy with that. But because of the personal interest and the challenge, we keep on doing it. So yeah, that's the only answer that I can give you, because what you're saying is pretty correct. We can use EEG like motor neuron or motor activity. EEG would be sort of fairly easier to predict. But yeah, you're absolutely right. And for some reason, not for some reason, but I have some motivation to go ahead with it. So yeah,
fair enough.
Go ahead with it.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
We have a question from Anna. So
Anna is asking us, are you able to model individual data and mental stress this way? Yes. So that's a type of a personalized modeling method that she's asking. Yes, Anna, we can do that. We can actually build personalized models. And see, like Dave earlier said, can we generalize it hugely? I'm not quite sure, but we can definitely recognize patterns. If there are patterns in the data, we can recognize patterns even individually. Yeah, that is possible.
I kind of have a question.
Yeah, just one moment. Anna, did I answer the question properly? Hopefully. Okay, cheers, thanks. Yeah, Lino.
Yeah, I'm not too familiar with like spiking neurons or like neural networks in terms of like neurons, like at that level. But I was just wondering, like where you found that pattern that having a larger amount of neurons, like bigger, doesn't necessarily lead to better. And is that a characteristic of spiky neurons then, that sort of characteristic?
Is it a characteristic? I'm not really, how can I answer this? Okay, it's not a known fact that spiking neural networks, you need lesser number of neurons. It is not a known fact or established thing. It's just that we realize that it has so many. So where we get onto this is that there are so many parameters to be tuned, right? So with each neuron added to the network, it takes so much of computation, so much of trouble to optimize these networks because there are a lot of parameters. So then we came up with the question, okay, does spiking neural networks actually have to be bigger? If they're smaller, there's easier way to optimize it. Computationally, it's efficient to optimize a smaller structure, right? So that's where we came to this question. It's not that it's a sort of a norm that we can use lesser number of neurons. No, there is no such norm as such, yeah. But the common practice is to use deep neural networks, right? That's where we saw the success previously. The image classifications, everything came from these deep neural networks that produced good results. So that continued. And some of the researchers use a lot of big neural networks with millions of neurons. Yeah, that is also possible. But what we saw was that we can actually reduce the number of neurons and get it to perform better. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Did I answer your question?
Yep.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions?
Actually, I have one. It's sorry, Ian Kirk here.
Hi, Ian. Yeah.
Again, lovely talk. Tough one to take on in less than an hour. And I probably had a sort of a lapse of concentration. But at one point, you talked about structural plasticity and then intrinsic plasticity in your networks. Could you tell me how the two things differ in your network? A little more detail about that.
Right, sure. So if I can share my presentation again. So let me. So, okay. So this is the layer that we are interested about, Ian. So this layer under the structural plasticity experiment, what we did was we added or removed neurons, right? We got the computer to add or delete neurons completely with the synapses, and we tested the accuracy. So we did that iteratively until we found a good accuracy level. And according the experiment resulted in a neural network that said 111 neurons for this particular or for this data set for BCI produced accuracies that seems to be robust, that seems to be better than overgrown or undergrown networks. So to you answer you again.
So let me interrupt you. Sorry, just a minute.
Yeah.
So you're basically you're just systematically removing or adding.
Yeah.
This isn't an activity dependent hidden layer sort of thing or anything like that.
So it's basically the removal or addition happens based on the feedback of the accuracy.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's not activity dependent at a neuron level.
But that'll be really interesting. That'll be super cool thing to do, because this is computerly costly. So if we can find out a way to add or delete neurons based on the activity, that means we don't have to go to this level. We can actually get things sorted out at this level itself without finding out the accuracy, which would be really cool.
That would be cool, but we haven't done that yet. Okay.
No. Yeah. In terms of intrinsic plasticity, your question, second one.
Yeah.
What we did was, let me get to that. Okay. So there is a training process that is happening. Usually what we have is a fixed threshold. Instead of having a fixed threshold, what we programmed was the neural threshold changes every time it spikes or doesn't spike. So if it spikes, each neuron in this layer would increase its threshold by a little bit. So it's like upping, giving a little bump to your threshold, so that if that neuron needs to spike again, there should be more spiking potential coming into it. Or if it did not spike, we reduce the threshold a little bit so that it becomes more sensitive to incoming input.
Okay,
So, yeah.
no, I'm with you. I think I just sort of missed that a little bit. So
Okay.
that's I guess that is more.
Now that is
more like an actual physiological
exactly,
process, I suppose.
Yeah.
Okay, no, thank you. That's answered my. Oh, and one thing.
Yeah.
So you, at the end, you said, going beyond spike timing dependent plasticity.
Yeah.
And I guess one of the things you could do is look at and in relation, I suppose, to intrinsic plasticity, is look at excitability rather than and pre and post synaptic excitability relative. Well, I suppose instead of spiking per se, as an extra sort of an extra layer, I suppose, in the process, because certainly in animal models, the spiking is important sometimes.
Okay.
The timing of the spiking is important sometimes, but the key thing for functional as opposed to structural plasticity is the relative excitation of the pre or the input and the output synapse, the coordination of excitability. So if you could somehow build I guess EPSPs and the timing of EPSPs into your model, I think that would be quite interesting as well. And having said that, I believe, and I'm not an expert in modeling at all, but I believe the Randy McIntosh and Victor Djurs's virtual brain does something of that sort.
Okay.
Yeah. Having said that, of course, everyone's always got an idea that actually is what they personally would like to know. I'm not suggesting you do it like next week or anything like that.
No, but it's definitely worth thinking, right? So yeah, ideas can take you a long way, so everything matters.
Let's see. Well, maybe it's a job for the next decade rather than next week. But thank you. Very good talk.
Thank you very much.
Am I allowed another question?
Yep. Yes.
Paul again. I was just thinking about this sort of. I wrote a little bit of it in the chat, but I was trying to articulate what I really meant. So I was thinking about this optimization of number of neurons, and then this act of kind of killing off the neurons that are not doing anything at some point. So is that effectively creating a network that is optimized for a particular function, right? For a particular discrimination or what have you, and then at the expense of its ability to do anything else, right? Maybe the reason why a particular optimal number of neurons works for a particular discrimination or a particular function is not because that's the optimal size of a network, but because that's the optimal size of the network for that thing. And the reason brains have 100 billion neurons is we do all sorts of stuff with them, and not just by stress and not stress or what have you.
So we haven't actually practically tested it, but I am pretty sure that the structural plasticity is it depends on the data set that we are using to train it. That's why we got different optimized structures for different data sets, right? So we use 2 data sets. So depending on the characteristics of the spiking, the number of neurons change. One used 111, one used 130. If we use another data set, it might use 200. So yes, what you're saying is true. So the cost of that is it's not generalizable across data sets.
Right.
Yeah, that is true.
So perhaps in some sense, what you're simulating is a cortical microcolumn or something like that, right? So, a bunch of neurons learning to do a particular thing, and then
exactly, yeah,
and then, setting them in stone, and that's what they do for the rest of their little electronic life.
Yeah, yeah, true that. Yeah, that is it. But if we can build something what Ian was suggesting, like depending on the spiking activity, if the structural plasticity can take place instead of a sort of optimization process. So that's a data-driven, direct data-driven process. So that will be, that's why it will be awesome. I mean,
no, that sounds like a really cool idea.
Yeah. How to do it, I'm not quite sure, but it's really cool.
That's that's why they pay you the big bucks, right?
That's always the next step, isn't it? How do you do this? Yeah. Get back to us.
Yeah, that's right. We'll be here.
It's fun. Okay. Anybody else? Ideas, questions, suggestions?
So how computationally intensive is this sort of thing to run? I mean, the sort of number of neurons is higher than I'm used to seeing in the old school neural nets, but also not very big. I mean, how can you push this thing?
So actually, SNNs like STDP is really fast when it comes to that unsupervised learning part. It's pretty fast. But when you take an optimization process, so like something like structural plasticity optimization, that'll cost about for the BCI data set, that costed about 5 days of full computation on i7 16 GB RAM.
So it takes a lot.
It does. It's just because, like we discussed, it's not dependent on the spiking activity. Rather, we have to go through the whole thing and get the accuracy and then change the network. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. That is the case.
Cool. Thank you very much, both of you. It was really interesting.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Mahima.
Thank you, Ian.
Yeah, so looks like we're pretty much at the end of the session. Thank you very much, Mahima, and thank you, Professor Parry. Thanks for everyone for coming as well, and we'll be posting the recording of the session, mailing it to the Cogneuro list, and also mail it to you, Mahima. And we should be having a new session next week as well, which I'll post that as well to the mailing list. So hopefully we'll have that one in person, and see you next time.
Magic.
Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Yeah, very good. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.